check it?
Yeah, the same. The light was on.
You guys are sure you checked it?
Yeah.
They stepped into lines expecting thrills, but what waited for them was terror. These are the amusement park deaths so disturbing, the parks wish they would forget it ever happened. Tyre Sampson. On the night of March 24, 2022, Orlando's Icon Park was alive with the sounds of tourists, music, and flashing lights. Among the crowd was 14-year-old Tyre Sampson, a talented footballer visiting Florida during spring break with his friends. Tyre was big and strong, standing over 6 feet tall and weighing more than 300 pounds. His dreams were huge, and so was his excitement as he and his friends approached one of the park's newest attractions, the Orlando Free Fall, a towering 430-foot drop ride. The ride looked terrifying but thrilling. Riders would be slowly lifted into the sky, taking in the view of the entire city before descending at 70 miles per hour. For teens seeking adrenaline, it was irresistible, but from the moment Tyre stepped towards the ride, warning signs were already there. As Tyre was seated, the operator struggled. Most drop towers have a clear right click when a harness locks, but the Tyre's restraint sits higher than those of others. He was almost 100 pounds over the ride's maximum passenger limit of 287 pounds. Other riders at the park had turned him away earlier that night for the same reason. But on this ride, no scale was used, no further check was done, and no operator stepped forward to refuse the seating. Unknown to Tyre and to everyone, the seat did not fit him safely. As the ride began to rise, Tyre's friends noticed his restraint wasn't holding him tightly. The riders rose higher, pausing at the peak. Then came the drop, but only seconds into the fall, everything went terribly wrong. Tyre slipped downward in his seat, the wide gap offering no protection. In an instant, he was thrown from the ride hundreds of feet through the air.
Check it?
Yeah, the same. The light was on.
You guys are sure you checked it?
Yeah.
People on the ground screamed as they saw his body separate from the tower. Riders shouted for the operators to stop the ride, but it was too late. Tyre hit the ground with devastating force. Bystanders rushed to him. Someone dialed 911 immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but the injuries were catastrophic. Tyre Sampson was pronounced dead shortly after. In the days that followed, investigators discovered something shocking. The harness sensor for Tyre's seat had been manually adjusted and widened significantly so that the rider's control system would incorrectly read it as locked even when it was not. Videos recorded by witnesses went viral, sparking nationwide outrage and prompting demands for accountability. In May 2023, the Tyre Sampson Act was signed into law, requiring a seatbelt and harness for any ride over 100 feet and for all rides to be regularly commissioned, certified, and tested by a separate regulatory agency. Dreamworld Thunder River Rapids. On the afternoon of 25th of October 2016, Australia's Dreamworld theme park was busy with families enjoying a warm Queensland day. Among its many attractions was the Thunder River Rapid, a long-running ride that simulates a fast-moving river. But that day, nothing was normal behind the scenes. Earlier that morning, one of the ride's essential water pumps had already shown signs of trouble. This pump helped to maintain the flow and depth of water needed to keep the rafts moving safely. Staff reset it, as they had done many times before, but no engineer was called and no shutdown occurred. By mid-afternoon, the ride was still operating despite the warnings. At around 2:09 p.m., the water pump failed. Instantly, the water level in the channel dropped. With less water to support the rafts, the flow slowed and became uneven. One raft, completely empty, became stranded at the top of the conveyor belt, sitting where no raft should ever be. No emergency stop was activated. No alarm sounded. The ride continued. Moments later, a raft carrying 6 passengers approached the conveyor, 4 adults and 2 children, unaware of the danger ahead. As the family raft reached the conveyor, the mechanical belt grabbed it and began pulling it upward, as it did in every cycle. But ahead of them, the stranded, empty raft blocked the path. With the water level far too low, the moving raft didn't float. It slammed directly into the empty one. In an instant, everything turned catastrophic. The collision caused the occupied raft to lift and flip forward. 4 of the riders were thrown out of their seats. 2 of them were crushed instantly between the conveyor and the metal framework. The other 2 were dragged into the ride's internal machinery, trapped beneath the moving belt, where they drowned in seconds. The children, sitting higher on the raft, were thrown clear of the conveyor path as it flipped, miraculously escaping with minor physical injuries. A park employee nearby hit an emergency stop button, but it did nothing. The conveyor kept running because the stop switch didn't control the part of the ride that needed to be halted. Staff members were left powerless as the tragedy unfolded before them. Within minutes, first responders arrived, but the situation was already beyond saving. 4 lives had been taken in a matter of seconds on what was supposed to be one of the safest rides in the park. The investigation began, and it was discovered that the ride's safety systems were inadequate, the result of years of cost-cutting and poor management. In September 2020, Dreamworld's parent company, Ardent Leisure, pleaded guilty to safety breaches and was fined $3.6 million. The Thunder River Rapid Ride was permanently closed and later demolished. Rosie Esparza. On the evening of July 19, 2023, the summer hits take over Six Flags Over Texas as families packed into the park for a night of true fun and fireworks. Among the visitors was 52-year-old Rosie, a mother enjoying a day out with her children. They were excited to end the day with one of the park's most famous attractions, the Texas Giant, a hybrid roller coaster towering 153 ft into the sky. The Texas Giant is an old wooden roller coaster, but after a multi-million-dollar renovation, it became one of the fastest and most intense rides, known for its violent high-speed drops. As Rosie and her son were seated in the coaster car, she noticed something was wrong. Her lap bar made only a single click instead of locking firmly like the others around her. She checked again and again. Concerned, she flagged a nearby ride attendant. Instead of removing her from the ride or properly checking the restraint, the attendant leaned over and pressed the bar. With a loud clank, the giant train rolled out of the station and began its slow, towering climb toward the first massive drop. At the top of the lift hill, the train paused for a split second and then dropped at a 79-degree angle. As the coaster accelerated, riders screamed with excitement, but their screams would soon turn to horror. Rosie suddenly rose out of her seat as the train whipped into the first major descent. She lifted upward, no longer holding her in place. Before anyone could process what happened, Rosie was ejected from the speeding train, thrown into the air with terrifying force. Below the track, the tragic outcome slowly became clear. Rosie's body had landed on a steeply angled metal rooftop in a restricted maintenance area. By the time emergency responders arrived, her body was severed. The park closed the ride immediately. When investigators examined the coaster cars, they learned that the Texas Giant did not have a seatbelt backup system, only the lap bar. More troubling still, maintenance logs showed previous restraint issues on the coaster in the days leading up to Rosie's death. The tragedy raised harsh criticism of Six Flags' oversight. Though the park argued that the ride met industry standards, the evidence told a different story. The Texas Giant closed for months, reopening only after major safety modifications. Big Dipper disaster at Krug Park. On the summer afternoon of July 24, 1930, Krug Park in Omaha, Nebraska, bustled with families seeking relief from the heat. The sounds of laughter, carnival music, and distant screams from thrill rides filled the air. For many visitors, the park's star attraction was the Big Dipper, a towering wooden roller coaster. The Big Dipper had thrilled visitors for over a decade. But on this day, hidden beneath the tracks and aging wooden frame, a silent danger was waiting. As 2 coaster trains cycled through the course, a small but critical mechanical failure began to reveal itself. The brake shoe bolt had a loose nut. Over time, the loose nut allowed the brake mechanism to shift out of place. With each run of the train, the bolt wore down even further. No one noticed. By late afternoon, passengers lined up for what they believed would be a thrilling but harmless ride. 4 passengers filled the first car, and the ride began. As the coaster creaked up the initial lift hill, the wooden frame groaned, swaying naturally as it always had. Riders braced themselves, hands gripping the safety bar. At the top, the train paused for a moment, then descended the first drop, speeding through every turn. But when it reached a high curve, disaster struck. The loose nut on the brake shoe bolt had finally given way. The brake detached completely. As the first car hit the curve, the dangling metal piece swung violently downward, striking the wooden crossbeams of the structure. The impact tore through the aging support with a force the old coaster was never designed to withstand. The structure shook. The force then ripped into the guide rail. Unable to hold the speeding train on the track, the guide rail gave way entirely. In an instant, 4 cars detached from the track and plunged off the side of the coaster. Screams erupted across the park. Onlookers watched in horror as the cars crashed to the ground below. 3 passengers were instantly killed. The last passenger, Rutt Farrell, only 15 years old, was alive when the rescuers arrived, but died shortly after being taken to the hospital. 17 others were injured as chaos unfolded around the fallen cars. The tragedy shook Omaha to its core. The Omaha City Club voted to ban roller coasters entirely within the city limits. While Krug Park continued to operate with its other attractions, the shadow of the Big Dipper tragedy hung over it, and by 1949, the park closed completely. The Big Dipper disaster remains the deadliest roller coaster accident in U.S. history. Disneyland Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. On the morning of September 5, 2003, Disneyland's Frontierland came alive with the usual excitement. Families gathered at the gates of Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, one of the park's most iconic attractions. The ride is themed as a runaway train speeding through the deserts of the Old West, known for its sharp turns and quick drops. But that day, behind the cheerful whistles and rumbling tracks, something was wrong. Passengers boarded the train as usual, filling the 10 cars that made up the ride. Among them was Marcelo Torres, seated in the first passenger car. The locomotive at the very front of the train, designed to decorate, wasn't meant to carry people. Moments after boarding, the train rolled out of the station. A part of the train's brake assembly had begun to malfunction. At the top of the lift, the train climbed the hill and entered the first turn. Everything seemed normal. Riders laughed, held onto their seats, and braced for the swooping drops. But as the train approached a tunnel, a major mechanical failure occurred. The decorative locomotive, which should have stayed firmly attached, lifted off the track due to the faulty brake connection. Without proper support, the locomotive derailed and jammed into the tunnel's interior. The sudden stop caused the rest of the train to crash into the derailed engine, collapsing the front passenger car behind it. Inside the dark tunnel, riders were thrown forward with tremendous force. Shouts filled the enclosed space as adults tried to orient themselves and each of their children. Passengers in the car behind felt the violent jolt but could not see what had happened ahead. Moments later, cast members and bystanders rushed to the scraps, the tunnel filled with frightened voices. Disneyland's emergency response team arrived quickly, assisting riders out of the train. 10 passengers sustained injuries. Marcelo Torres, seated in the first car behind the locomotive, suffered trauma and did not survive. When investigators began examining the wreckage, the truth became clear. The cause of the derailment wasn't an accident, it was human error. The California Occupational Safety and Health Administration found that the train's brake assembly had been improperly installed during maintenance. Disneyland faced intense scrutiny. The incident was a devastating blow for a park known globally for its flawless safety record. In response, Disney conducted a top-to-bottom review of its maintenance operations. Big Thunder Mountain Railroad remained closed for over a year, reopening only after major upgrades and redesigned safety systems. The 2003 derailment remains one of the most serious accidents in Disneyland's history. Bell's Amusement Park Wildcat. On April 20, 1997, Bell's Amusement Park in Tulsa, Oklahoma, buzzed with the energy of a busy spring weekend. Families lined up for rides, children ran between attractions, and the classic wooden Wildcat roller coaster rattled through its familiar loops and turns. The ride had been part of the park for decades, fast, bumpy, and thrilling, but never considered especially dangerous. But that afternoon, a hidden mechanical failure was about to turn a routine ride into one of the park's darkest moments. Dozens of guests boarded the Wildcat throughout the day, unaware that problems had already been quietly developing in the coaster's brake system. The brakes responsible for slowing and spacing out the trains were supposed to be tested, inspected, and adjusted regularly. By that evening, the problem had escalated. A train filled with passengers left the loading platform and climbed the first hill. As it sped through the course, riders laughed and braced against the sharp wooden turns. But when the train reached a brake zone mid-ride, something went terribly wrong. The brakes failed. Instead of slowing smoothly, the train jerked to an abrupt, unexpected stop on the track. The riders inside were confused, shaken, and unsure what had happened. Some thought it was just a technical pause. Others looked behind them, worried, because they knew another coaster car would not be far behind. Down below, attendants were unaware of the stalled train. There was no automatic warning system to alert staff that a car had stopped unexpectedly on the track. Moments later, the second train loaded with passengers, including several teenagers, raced through the course at full speed. It approached the same brake zone, still unaware of the stalled train ahead. There was no time to stop. The second car slammed into the back of the stationary train with immense force. The impact shook the entire structure, sending passengers forward and throwing the ride into chaos. Screams erupted as riders tried to understand what had happened. Those in the first train felt the violent push from behind. Those in the second were jolted by the sudden crushing stop. Park staff rushed to the scene, climbing onto the wooden track structure to reach the stranded and injured riders. Emergency crews arrived within minutes and worked carefully to free passengers one by one. Among the victims was a 13-year-old Patrick John Carec, who tragically lost his life after he was thrown from the coaster, hitting his head on one of the metal bars. 6 other passengers were injured, some seriously, and were transported to local hospitals. In the days that followed, investigators from the Oklahoma Department of Labor examined the wreckage and the ride's maintenance logs. Their findings were clear and troubling. The Wildcat's brake system had not been appropriately maintained. Regular inspections were incomplete or not performed at all. The crash was not a result of unpredictable mechanical failure. It stemmed from improper maintenance and oversight. Following the investigation, Bell's Amusement Park faced intense scrutiny. Although the Wildcat reopened after modifications and repairs, the park's reputation never fully recovered. Years later, Bell's permanently closed, and many in Tulsa still associate the park with the memory of that tragic day. If you want to explore more disturbing videos, check out our video on the worst zipline accidents ever recorded.